On Sunday, March 20th, President Obama arrived in Havana, Cuba, which marks the first time in 80 years that a U.S. president has set foot there. He was talking with the people of Cuba and Cuban President Raul Castro. So going forward, what does this mean not only for the United States, but for the people of Cuba? I interviewed a couple professors here at MSU and also spoke with the director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida University. Here's what they had to say. I interviewed Donna Rich Kaplowitz, an assistant professor at Michigan State University. Here's what President Barack Obama's trip to Cuba meant to her. She says, "This is absolutely not a publicity stunt. At long last, a U.S. president has had the foresight to see that a policy we have implemented since 1961 has failed to achieve the results we intended, the overthrow of Fidel Castro. Obama's sane and accurate position of normalizing relations will yield far more progress in terms of both human and economic rights than anything his predecessors have done." Professor McGee, an international relations professor at Michigan State University, also agreed to sit down and discuss the implications of the U.S. embargo on Cuba and what he believes will happen going forward with Cuba. Here's his interview.
Malcolm McGee, and he's going to talk to us a little on the history with the U.S. and Cuba. Tell us a little bit of the history between the U.S. and Cuba with foreign policy.
Yeah, well, obviously the history goes back to the Spanish-American War of 1898, and before Cuba is a very close neighbor to the United States.
Okay.
The current history, though, really is a vestige of the Cold War
Okay.
and the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Nikita Khrushchev and John Kennedy tried to one-up each other on the missiles in Turkey and Italy versus missiles in Cuba, and both sides backed down, but the embargo that was left in place, and as a result of that, it has never been taken down.
I think that the travel restrictions recently in place a couple years ago and Cuba being on the terrorist list was actually necessary?
Again, I think that's a vestige of the Cold War. I think that the political tensions between the two countries exacerbated these kinds of policies. But I don't think they were necessary. I think the sooner these restrictions go away, the quicker Cuba and the U.S. can normalize relations.
Okay, and what does this mean going forward for the U.S. and Cuba now?
Well, for Cuba, with a economy of only about 75 billion a year and 11 million people, it does allow business to increase. The Cuban economy could grow as a result of this. For the United States, I think it provides sort of this once forbidden place will be a place a lot of tourists would like to go to. Typically, I think without these restrictions, the U.S. and Cuba would find an awful lot of common ground. We're so close together. There's so many things that we can cooperate on. And the new generation, both in the United States and in Cuba, is not the generation that had the conflict. And so as these people come into power, I think they're going to be more likely to not worry about these past issues.
All right, well, I'd like to thank you, Professor McGee, for doing this interview, and thanks for watching.
All right.
I also got an interview with Sebastian Arcos, the director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida University. He says the events since the announcement on December 17, 2014, of a new U.S. policy on Cuba have been closely followed by the Cuban American community. The new policy is quite controversial, but with many Cuban Americans in favor and many against. It is difficult to find a middle ground. Obviously, the topic of U.S.-Cuba relations is very important for Cuban Americans who actively participate in local and national political debate on one side or the other.